For a conversation on building ethical artificial intelligence tools, please welcome Tom Gann, Chief Policy Officer for McAfee, Meredith Broussard, author and professor at New York University, and Chris Calabrese, Vice President of Policy for the Center for Democracy and Technology. To lead the discussion, please welcome Atlantic Senior Editor Ross Anderson.
Chris, Meredith, Tom, thanks for being with us here this morning. Meredith, I want to start with you to frame our discussion. We're going to be talking about artificial intelligence, as you know, and you have this really provocative way of kind of summing up the flaws with AI by saying that AI fundamentally misunderstands the world. Can you maybe tell us a bit more about what you mean by that? And then I was hoping that, Tom and Chris, you might respond to that.
Great, thanks. So the book is about the inner workings and outer limits of technology. And one of the things that I discovered through teaching computational methods to journalists, which is what I do in my day job, one of the things I discovered was that there is a lot of misunderstanding out there about what technology can and cannot do. So we've gotten into this rhetoric, especially around artificial intelligence, where people say, oh, well, because we have AI now, we can do anything. And it reminds me a lot of the rhetoric in the 90s about the internet. Oh, we have the internet now, and we have the web now, we can do anything. And so I think we need to look to history for a greater understanding of technology and really be honest with ourselves about what technology can and can't do. So there are fundamental limits to what we can do with computers. Computers, ultimately what they do is they compute, right? It's in the name. And they do math. When a computer does something, it's converting the real world into math, which is incredible. It is just a majestic human achievement. But there are things that math can't do. And there are ways that we can't use math to understand the world, and that's okay. But I think we need to inject that understanding, that nuance, into our conversations about technology.
Just to give Tom and Chris something to latch on to, when you say, and I believe you, that there are things that math cannot do, what are the sort of first examples that kind of spring to mind for you?
Love.
Yeah, yeah.
Some people love their computers a lot, though.
People do love their computers. Yeah. So something else interesting that happens is that we anthropomorphize computers a lot, and we get this kind of fixation on the computing objects that we love. Like people have this kind of cathexis with their phone. The people who feel anxiety when they're separated from their phone. And that's a very human phenomenon. I mean, you've got your phone up here, right?
Yeah, right. Well, I've got my notes on my phone.
Yeah. So I think we just need to look at that and need to say, it's kind of a dumb object.
Tom, let me ask you, I didn't think we'd get here so quickly, but can computers love? I'm just kidding. I was wondering, in the course of your work, if have you kind of developed a theory as to what AI can do really well and what it's actually really crappy at?
Well, to a degree. So we're in the cybersecurity business. That's our entire focus. AI has had great promise for cybersecurity in many ways, improving the ability to predict cyber attacks, creating efficiencies in organizations when they are unable to hire enough cyber experts. These are all good things. That said, it is possible with an AI system in cyber to over-optimize it such that it will, in its attempt to be so efficient, it can also produce many false positives. So it will stop transmissions of communications that it may perceive as being malware, but when in fact they're not. What we've found is we commingle our AI engine with global threat intelligence, which is a different heuristic way of looking at the entire threat landscape, where you try to commingle huge data sets. And then that coupled with an AI engine, and then most importantly, human judgment, that combination tends to produce the best outcomes from a protective point of view. So at the end of the day, I think AI's got great opportunities, but there are also limitations that have to be managed by people who actually have at their best, the moral guidance to make good decisions.
Would you say that, is there a trajectory of improvement over the last 3-4 years as machine learning has really taken hold on precisely the sort of anomaly spotting artificial intelligence that you're talking about? Like, I noticed that my credit card is turned off less frequently when I travel now, partly because I actually call them and tell them I'm going, but it used that not even that would do the trick previously. Do you feel like you guys are getting better at that?
Oh, sure. So much of what we take for granted today in the digital world derives from the benefits of AI. You know, getting faster approvals on transactions. You know, despite the pernicious nature of certain types of social media advertising, you know, it's kind of neat when you're Googling for something and you see options pop up instantaneously. That said, you know, there are costs, there are privacy challenges, there are surveillance possibilities, and these are all things that require a great deal of balancing.
You mentioned privacy issues, and Chris, that happens to be your domain of expertise. Can you tell us, are there ways that AI fundamentally misunderstands the world that are sort of terrible for privacy?
I mean, I always feel bad because AI is a tool. It's going to do some things well, it's going to do some things badly, usually because human beings have, you know, taught it to act that way. I think certainly we've already heard a lot about face recognition, which is a technology powered in large part by AI and machine learning, which certainly can be very invasive. By the same token, we've seen, and similarly, every time we talk about, for example, identifying someone as a potential fraudster, that's often like machine learning making a judgment about a human being. And if you just put those 2-3 words together, you can sort of think, wow, that's a little scary. That's machines judging us and having real world impacts. So certainly, you know, and all of this comes from an abundance of personal information that's out there about all of us already. So in many ways, we've already given up the personal information. It's already driving the AI. Now, we're not going to put the genie back in the bottle, but at minimum, the genie needs to work for us, and we need to regulate it, and we need to figure out the technologies, the ways we're going to use that technology, and the ways that we're not going to let it be used.
And one thing that's interesting to me about this is that most of us, you know, even though we don't apply fancy words like machine learning and artificial intelligence, most of us have sort of entered into a social contract around lending, for instance, where we expect a good amount of our consumer data to be hoovered up by financial institutions, and the credit bureaus, you know, gather all this information and issue a score. Is it qualitatively different that it's machine learning doing that now?
You know, I think that if it's a difference, I think it's instructive to know how much regulation there is around lending.
Yeah.
You can't just willy-nilly do whatever you want. If you're a credit bureau or if you're a lender, you've got tremendous number of rules you've got to follow. You've got to let somebody know, for example, why you didn't give them a loan. You've got to explain what happened. And it's exactly those kind of protections that I think we're going to need to build in as we build AI systems. You made a judgment about me, artificial intelligence. I'm going to need to understand why, so I can know if it was a mistake, or if it's something that I can change or improve, like my credit score, how I can do that. And those kind of regulations I think we're missing right now.
How do we work with this tension, like Meredith, as a professor and someone who's sort of interested in the advance of knowledge? I'm sure you two are as well.
She's better at it.
Yeah. I was having a fascinating conversation in New York last week with the Montefiore hospital folks who are doing a kind of unprecedented big data AI system where they bring in just tons and tons of data streams about patients, including, you know, where they live and the health conditions around where they live, and every sensor that attaches to them from the moment they walk into a hospital, from their heart rate or whatever it may be, in order so they can predict, you know, respiratory failure and all these kinds of neat things that we want them to predict, but also a great deal of personal information, and personal information which will likely be of great use to the scholars and medical students of the future. How do you think about that tension in your mind as to how we should be balancing a desire to kind of know everything about everyone and you know, our various serious concerns about privacy?
So I would go to our notion of what it would mean if we could know everything about a person. Because there's this underlying fantasy that if we use more and more technology, we will know everything and then we will not need people anymore. Right? So to go back to what Tom was saying earlier, there is a kind of notion that somehow we're going to be able to build enough technology to get rid of people. And that is, it's really strange to me, honestly.
Where do you see that kind of thinking most?
So it's a fantasy that I call techno-chauvinism, the idea that technology is superior to people. And it actually dates back to the very earliest era of our thinking about the digital. So our digital world was really, or our thinking about technology and society was really established by 1960s hippies who, their communes failed, but there was this uncharted world of cyberspace, and they said, oh, well, you know, we are going to build this world of cyberspace that's going to have no government, and it's going to be better. And that just didn't, it wasn't the case, it isn't the case. But along with that, there was this fantasy that computers would replace people. And so really what we need to be thinking about is we need to be thinking about human-in-the-loop systems. We need to stop imagining that it is possible to build some kind of medical diagnostic system that does not involve doctors, right? So the kind of underlying fantasy of let's use AI in medicine, a lot of the time it boils down to let's get rid of doctors, let's get rid of nurses, let's get rid of PAs, let's get rid of all the expensive, complicated human elements so that we can make more money. And that's not actually a world that we want to live in, right? Nobody wants to have a medical experience that is devoid of human beings.
Sure.
So I think we just need to push back at the notion that artificial intelligence is going to be this magnificent force that's going to replace everything. And instead of thinking about autonomous systems that don't involve humans, we need to think about human-in-the-loop systems and how can computers and humans work together to make a better world for humans.
Could you imagine a world where, although humans would not be totally replaced, for instance, you'd want some degree of human touch just in the kind of bedside manner way, like you don't want to hear from HAL 9000 in your oncology appointment, or just like some sort of last ditch, if the computer is recommending a very serious procedure, quadruple bypass, you want to have like a doctor looking over their shoulder, but that might be a drastically reduced medical force, and would that be okay with you?
I think about the times that I go to the doctor and the doctor is on their computer instead of looking at me, or like when the computer is in the corner, at my doctor's office, there's a desktop that sits in the room, and sometimes the doctor actually has to face away from me in order to use the computer, and it's just this very alienating experience.
Yeah.
So when I'm getting medical care, I want to be cared for. I want somebody to look me in the eye and talk to me. And so I think it's great to have diagnostic tools that help doctors. But there's a lot that doctors can do because doctors have cognitive abilities. They have these very sophisticated diagnostic abilities. There's a lot doctors can do that machines can't do. So I think the optimal situation is doctors and machines working together. So think about diagnosis in radiology, for example. Absolutely, yes, we should have AI scans that identify tumors, but we should not imagine that because we have that, we don't need radiologists anymore.
Yeah. Tom, I want to ask you, in thinking about, you mentioned earlier that you're thinking of your team sort of working with a sort of AI plus human teamwork, and just the way Meredith was describing. I'm fascinated. We've all watched the AlphaGo results with a great deal of interest. This is the Go playing AIs that are now just beating world champions with some ease, and that the players, the human players themselves, express this kind of degree of awe over the complexity of their moves and the counterintuitive nature of their moves. How are you finding that on the sort of the cyber attacks that you're looking to thwart? Are the human is maybe in the loop much more in how they're programming it. How is the sort of human cyber attackers versus human plus AI teams on your ends? What's the arms race like there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So here's the big thing to remember. The attackers still have the advantage. I don't care if you're talking about the biggest and best cybersecurity companies in the world, the best startups, even in many cases governments. Hackers, teams of hackers are able to out-innovate defenders currently, given the state of the science, simply because you just have to be right once as an attacker. You have to be right all the time as a defender. That's just a basic element of strategy. The attackers are able to network very quickly. They're not limited by laws and regulations. And in many cases, the economic returns of attacking are huge. You know, for every dollar you invest, you might get a 10K or 100K return. Or I should say 100x return. The challenge is we have a huge cyber skills deficit. CSIS did a study about a year ago and projected out about a 1.5 million person deficit in cyber skills across the board. So there's a lot of investment needed in STEM. But AI has the ability to automate functions so that we can move faster, we can respond more in real time, because the hackers are leveraging more and more advanced technology. They too are starting to leverage AI, and it's just this terrible arms race. So we have to automate, we have to use larger data sets, but here's the key point. We always have to keep humans in the loop to make the right decisions, because if you get a fully automated AI-powered cyber event that starts to spin out of control, you know, machines really don't have the wisdom to make the right calls. So we have to be extremely careful in the way in which we deploy AI.
And given that the asymmetric nature of this sort of conflict, is it possible that the other side, the cyber attacking side, will be more cavalier in not wanting to keep a human in the loop and actually be delighted if there's some sort of
absolutely
effect?
Potentially that is one of the that is one of the truly scary scenarios we need to plan for. And I think, you know, from an ethics point of view, it is balancing the upside and the downside from new technology innovations in such a way that we can produce optimal social outcomes. That's really the obligation from an ethics point of view.
I want to go to some audience questions in a minute, but first, Chris, I want to ask you, you mentioned earlier, you made the excellent point that, as a retort to my credit bureau example, that there's quite a bit of regulation around privacy in the lending industry as it's currently constituted. We've seen a kind of cultural shift over the past, let's say, 5 to 10 years, where in the late aughts, tech had a great deal of cultural power and prestige that maybe under one theory insulated them from sort of political consequences, even from kind of privacy transgressions that were starting to become apparent at the time. That has certainly shifted. People like Mark Zuckerberg or whoever else are kind of not regarded as out and out villains, but at least the public has much more of a skeptical eye about them. And from your perspective, has that helped juice along the process to arrive at new norms and forget norms, actual regulations around privacy?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I think it's a little bit of this is a cultural moment that's not just about one thing, right? I mean, certainly the technology is impacting more people's lives, and that means it's having more negative impacts as well, and that's just a reality. I think we're seeing sort of a general feeling that there's a substantial inequality in the United States, and tech is part of the problem there, and that's another factor. We're also seeing that, whether it's the state of California or Europe, are saying we have different cultural values around privacy, and we're going to pass legislation, and that's another thing that's pushing us along. So I would say, and honestly, I would say the election of President Trump, a lot of people felt like that was if not tech's fault, certainly it played a significant role, and that underscored to a lot of people the seriousness of these questions. So all those things, you put them together, and you have a pretty substantial current towards more regulation. I think what it'll look like, I think, is very much still up in the air, but I think we're going to see something, and we're going to see it in a near-term horizon, 1 to 3 year horizon.
Do you ever worry? I mean, a colleague of mine, he and I were in Slack going back and forth about the headline for a piece about precisely this question, and we sort of co-coined this phrase, privacy nihilism. And we worry because, we used to see whenever there was a big data breach at one of the large companies, it was like, oh, we really have to cover this, what a big news event. However, hundreds of millions of people's personal data has been exposed. And to be honest, we feel, I'm embarrassed to say, less and less pressure to do that because the public kind of shrugs their shoulder. Everyone sort of has this baseline assumption that all my personal data is on the dark web anyway. How do you kind of fight that, a certain fatigue around these issues?
Sure. I mean, I guess what I would say is sort of data breaches are one very narrow category of thing that privacy people worry about. And it's ironically, the data breach laws essentially were passed in order to raise awareness with the assumption that it would lead to sort of regulation more broadly. And instead, we sort of stopped at data breach for about 10 years. But now this conversation that we're having is a privacy conversation. It's all about how we're using data in society. When we talk about how Facebook moderates content and how it combats hate speech, that's a privacy conversation. So I think, in fact, we're having more of these conversations. They're having more regulatory touches. So certainly I could see us in a place where we don't feel like we have robust regulation. I think that's certainly a real and legitimate possibility. But I think we are broadening the conversation in a more realistic way about how technology is impacting our lives.
And I think something interesting about the fact that the conversation is about privacy is that it's really expanded now, where when we're talking about privacy, we're also talking about inequality. Because privacy is not applied equally across the socioeconomic spectrum.
Sure.
People who have less money, who have less access to resources, are increasingly being judged by automated systems, whereas rich people are judged by humans. And it's a lot easier to get through the system when you're being judged by humans as opposed to by these automated systems, because everybody kind of throws up their hands and says, oh, well, the computer says this.
Virginia Eubanks is a great scholar, famously said, if you want to see the future of surveillance, look at where poor people are right now. Look at how food stamps are handled. I mean, you're seeing neighborhoods. There are many more surveillance cameras, for example, in poorer communities. The future is now. It's just not evenly distributed. That's another famous science fiction quote. But you're seeing a lot more surveillance amongst the poor than you are amongst affluent people who can afford to pay their way out of it.
I want to take this time to go to an audience question or two. We got right here in the front.
Hi.
Microphone.
Sidney Friedberg, Hi, Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense, and former National Journal Group person, actually. I come from the defense world, where what you use AI for is a little different and gets ethically naughty, with a K, but other way too, perhaps. So I'm curious, from a privacy standpoint, from a cybersecurity standpoint, from a broader ethical standpoint. We've seen companies refuse to work on DoD contracts for fears of privacy or automation being used for lethal force, though DoD policy says all the things about keeping the human in the loop that you guys have said. But is there an ethical obligation for companies and individuals to not work on defense projects or espionage projects so they could violate privacy or end up with so-called killer robots? Is there an ethical obligation to work on them because even if you're a tech person, you're not a citizen of the world, a citizen of a country, or somewhere in between?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, we view AI as a tool, and it's a tool that you can use well, and it's a tool you can use badly. I think that given this relatively experimental nature of AI, I would be deeply troubled if it, as we've already made the point several times, became sort of like the frontline decision-making tool in a system that was a life and death situation. So I think that's something that's appropriately aligned, but I don't think we're going to be able to sort of keep AI out of the defense, sector. I think that ship has already long sailed.
We got.
Yes, hi. Good morning. Up here?
Nope.
Back.
There we are.
Hi there, Antonio Orsi, focused on health policy issues. Maybe circling back on this conversation of building ethically, and as we think around health, what are certain guardrails we might want to consider? Currently we're having these challenges of access to health, outcomes focus, and AI I find to be a great opportunity to really tackle a lot of these issues, whether it be telemedicine, whether it be direct in-home care, et cetera. When you think about building ethically, what are certain guardrails you would want to take into consideration?
So when I think about guardrails, I think about common sense. So for a very long time, we've been involved in this techno-chauvinist rhetoric that, oh, we just need to put technology into everything. And we kind of stop there. So I think we need to get beyond the idea that we need more technology everywhere, because the digital revolution is over, right? Like tech is mundane now. And we need to couple a deeper understanding of technology with greater common sense. Because the first finding that we find with AI or with data science or with big data, the first things that people find when they go into a new field is they find the things that people already know, right? So like when you use AI to analyze health outcomes, guess what? Poor people have worse health outcomes than rich people. Like that's the finding that you get. So we don't really need incredibly complicated, sophisticated, expensive AI tools to know that. Like we've already done that analysis, and we know it from social science, and we know it from history. So these are things we already know. So we need to get beyond the easy questions and think, can AI really help us make things better? Because how do you solve the problem of homelessness? Well, you don't solve homelessness with an app. You solve homelessness by giving people homes, right? So technology is not always the answer. And so we need to, as Alondra Nelson said recently, we need to open up a space to say no to technology. We need to say, all right, is technology the right tool for the task? If so, which technology? Is it AI? Is it something less sexy than AI, but equally useful? And we need to sometimes say no when we're getting out over our own skis, like when we're opening up new threat surfaces by implementing technology in a way that that creates opportunities for security breaches. Sometimes paper is really useful.
Tom, Meredith, Chris, thanks for being with us this morning. This was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.